If you're a person who has strong inclinations or habits of thought and action in one lifetime, you're likely to carry those with you into the next lifetime.
I'd like to welcome to the show Jeffrey Mishlove. How are you doing, Jeffrey?
Great, thanks. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you so much for being on the show. I really, really appreciate it. You have a fascinating journey, and you've been doing some amazing work over the years. So I really want to kind of dive into your path and your journey. First and foremost, how did you get started, in this path, in the spiritual path and parapsychology path? How did you get to start? How did you get started in this? What made you get into this?
Well, it probably goes back to my earliest childhood. As a 10-year-old kid, I began reading books from our local library about UFOs, and I started writing letters to some of the authors. So I think I've had this interest in the paranormal going back as far as I can remember. But then naturally you grow up, you try to assume adult responsibilities. Mm-hmm. I was a graduate student at Berkeley in 1972. If you had known me, you would have seen a person doing group therapy sessions at San Quentin prison with murderers and rapists.
Wow.
And it was at that time that I had a series of dreams. The most powerful one is one in which my great uncle Harry came to me in the dream. It was like more real than real. And I woke up from that dream just crying tears of joy. It was such a wonderful dream. And singing at the same time, which has never happened to me since then or before. And so I wrote home to my parents. I said, how's Uncle Harry? I had a dream about him. And my mother phoned me as soon as she got that letter and said, how did you know? That was when Uncle Harry died, right? Practically at the same moment. So that made me feel like I couldn't just continue on my criminology track. I needed to explore this further. I started talking to my professors at Berkeley, and I learned quickly none of them had anything intelligent to say about that kind of an experience. So I resolved that one way or another, I'd have to become my own expert. And eventually, I think I was guided by dreams, largely. I managed to create a very unique, individual, interdisciplinary doctoral major in parapsychology at Berkeley. And that was really the beginning of my professional involvement in this area nearly half a century ago.
Now, can you tell me what the Bigelow Institute prize that you received is? Because that was really what caught my eye when I was pitched to have you on the show. I was like, he did what? So I'd love to hear exactly what that is.
Well, Robert Bigelow is an entrepreneur in Las Vegas. He owns Budget Suites. It's a hotel chain. Mm-hmm. Residential hotel chain. And he also owns an aerospace company that got shut down during the pandemic. It was deemed a non-essential business. And for decades, he has been one of the major individuals financing research into the paranormal. And he decided to set up a new institute called the Bigelow Institute for Consciousness Studies. And one of the very first things they did was to establish this essay competition. Well, they decided, first of all, he had spent 20 years researching UFO activity and felt that he had pushed that about as far as he could. And so he wanted this new institute to focus on the question of survival after death. And so to initiate their program, he created an essay competition and for the best evidence for survival. The recent ABC affiliate in Las Vegas described it as possibly the biggest essay competition of all time to solve the biggest question of all time. And so I entered, and my entry won the grand prize.
So you prove that there is life after death with your essays, is basically what it says.
Yes, that's basically it. The standard was to provide evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that would be accepted in a court of law. And I think my background in criminology probably helped me in that regard.
So then let me ask you, I mean, you've had the pleasure of speaking to some amazing spiritual masters over the years and very interesting human beings, Ram Dass and so many others that I saw in your massive list of people you've spoken to over the decades. In your opinion, and I think I know the answer to this, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is there life after death? And prove your case, sir.
Well, of course, the evidence is overwhelming. Overwhelming.
Okay.
And the intriguing thing is that so many people in our culture today act as if, well, we can't be sure, we don't know, it might be this, it might be that, it might be all fantasy, because we live in such a materialistic age. But in my essay, I took several tacks, and basically I suggested we have to see the overview. I list 9 different independent lines of research that all point toward the existence of an afterlife. Everything from near-death experience, reincarnation memories of young children, after-death communications that people receive spontaneously, something known as instrumental trans communication, where there are tens of thousands of hobbyists around the world who are using computers and radios and other electronic devices, sometimes to engage in two-way communications with the deceased. And in the most extreme of such cases, there are 2 books written on this known as telephone calls from the dead. People actually engage in conversations back and forth for as long as half an hour with a deceased individual, someone they knew and recognized. Then you have, of course, all the spiritualist literature from mediums, physical mediums, as well as mental mediums. You have deathbed visions, the spontaneous experiences of people who are dying. You have something known as shared death experience, which is people who are in the room when someone is dying actually experience with them what it's like as they enter into the early stages of the afterlife. So I list in my essay dozens of what I call white crow examples. One of my intellectual heroes was William James, who's considered the founder of American psychology, but he was also deeply interested in this field and studied a great medium from the 19th century, Leonora Piper. He wrote, if you want to disprove the hypothesis that all crows are black, you only need to find one white crow. And then he said, Mrs. Piper is my white crow. Well, I have dozens and dozens of these white crows all across 9 independent lines of investigation. But that's just the start of this enormous evidence. Because in my own case, Alex, as I was explaining to you, it changed my life when Uncle Harry came to me in a dream. I was a criminology student, and today I can look back over half a century and say, when I shifted into parapsychology, that was a permanent change that occurred to me. And when you look at the literature, you find that people who encounter the afterlife, sometimes it is so powerful, it changes their lives permanently and dramatically.
Yeah, it's really interesting because so many people around the world believe in some sort of afterlife, because on Sunday billions of people show up to church, all over the world. There are different kinds of afterlife. So there is a need to believe that this is not it, without question. There's a need for that. But then there's things that happen to us in our life, our daily lives, that are so indescribable. Something like intuition. Something that's as simple as a gut instinct about a human being, about a situation, about don't go around that corner, about press the brake right now. Sometimes as you hear, I've actually happened in my life where I hear a voice say, don't do this, be careful with that. And it's a weird way it's not like an actual talking voice. It's a weird energy or feeling you get, but just something is instinct about you walk into a room and you're like, this is not a place I want to be right now. And you walk out and then maybe a fight breaks out, 5 or 10 minutes. It happened that to me many times in high school and when I was, clubbing back in the days when I was a young man. But something, I'll use something like intuition, because something like intuition, we all have it. Even when you meet somebody, you have a sense of who they are without them even opening their mouth sometimes. Is that a fair assumption?
Absolutely. Yeah. I used to be president of a nonprofit organization called the Intuition Network. And our goal was to create a world in which people felt encouraged to cultivate this talent. And we live in a culture which is kind of lopsided in the sense that if you're good at mathematics or if you're good at athletics, you get a lot of encouragement. But for people who are gifted intuitives, our culture sort of dismisses that as sort of airy-fairy, woo-woo. It doesn't count. It's not as important. And I think that's a shame.
I mean, but if you start looking at Eastern philosophies, Eastern religions, the yogis that were around, 2,000-3,000 years ago, you start looking at those, and I know you have done deep dives into those texts, the Bhagavad Gita, those kind of things. You start going deep into that stuff. People were talking about this stuff thousands of years ago, before Christ, even before Buddha, sometimes, depending on how far you go back. Yeah. But it is fascinating that in the East, it's so much more acceptable. And in the West, it's taken a while for the West to come up to it. And I always talk about the rising consciousness of humanity, whereas you speak about meditation in the 1950s or 60s, they would have looked at you with one eye, like, this guy's crazy. If you talk about yoga, it would have been, but now everybody understands yoga, understands the physical, the mental, even the spiritual benefits of something like yoga or meditation. One of the most scientifically studied areas ever. I mean, there's so many studies on meditation and the health benefits and all that stuff. But why do you think that it takes so long for the West to accept something that the East has been doing for thousands of years?
And even in the West for thousands of years. But
you have Native Americans, you're right.
Modern times, or the ancient Greeks. In modern times, let's say since the 18th century, Western culture has been an aberration overall. We've become heavily materialistic to the point where people think that if it's immaterial, for example, we say it doesn't matter. If we don't understand something, we say it doesn't make sense. So matter and sense is what counts. The external appearances seem to be what counts, and our internal realities are subjugated to a kind of colonization, you might even say, of the material world. So I would say our culture currently, Western culture for the last 200-300 years in particular, just has it backwards.
This seems to have begun at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, when now material things took over. Like before the Industrial Revolution, yes, of course, there was material things in England and in Europe, but nothing compared to what happened in the Industrial Revolution. The whole world became industrialized. We had machines doing things for us that we have never done before. So all of a sudden, I think our mindsets started to go towards the material, because you just see, I mean, we were building these giant structures and boats and bridges and planes and things that were just fantasy less than 100 years ago. Before H.G. Wells, no one talked about any of the kind of concepts of flying. I mean, maybe Da Vinci with the flying machine, but generally speaking, nobody really talked about a lot of this stuff that science fiction was talking about. But isn't it funny, after it was written in science fiction, less than 100 years later, we started to create a lot of the things that we were talking about.
Yeah, I think we became seduced by the power of our own technology, that the mechanistic, materialistic worldview was so effective when it came to building railroad trains and bombs, that we felt that we could describe all of reality as a mechanistic clockwork kind of process, to the point where we think that we human beings are nothing more than sophisticated machines ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an arrogance of humanity and of man specifically, that because I always say to people, no matter where you are in the history of man, they know at that moment in time that they know everything. Like they got it covered, So when the Greeks were like, that's it. It was Zeus. It happened to the Egyptians. They're like, Ra, you can't tell me that Ra doesn't exist. And it's constant. So it's a constant, really painful growth process. But I don't know I'm sure you've noticed this, but in the last 200 years, we've done such last 120 years, let's say, from the 19th century on, or 20th century on, the speed of growth has been immense, not only in the physical, but I feel also in the spiritual, specifically in the West, where concepts have flown in much faster than they have in 1,000 years prior.
I think one of the advantages of the internet, we live in a global culture these days, so we have access to the great wisdom teachings of every tradition. But still, our culture is still very heavily lopsided. A perfect example of this is the fact in 1980, I received a doctoral diploma from the University of California in parapsychology. Now, subsequently, to my knowledge, nobody in the United States has received a diploma from an accredited university at the doctoral level that says parapsychology. Like 40 years later, I'm still the only one.
That's really fascinating. So you have an actual PhD in parapsychology from Berkeley.
Yes, I do.
That is insane, because I've never heard of that even being a possibility.
Well, as I say, it was through a unique, individual, interdisciplinary doctoral major. And to be honest with you, there are groups of people who consider themselves the self-appointed skeptics and the promoters, the gatekeepers of reality, who believe we have to live in what they call a rational universe. And when they heard that the university was about to award a doctoral degree in parapsychology, they put enormous pressure on the university not to do that. And even after the degree was awarded, these skeptics, so-called skeptics, they're not real skeptics in a philosophical sense, but they put pressure on the university to retract the degree.
That's pretty well. I mean, but look, like Einstein said, great minds always are thwarted by simple minds or smaller minds, or something along those lines. Yeah. Now, within all the studies that you've done over the course of your career, can you touch upon a concept that so many different religions and philosophies have touched upon for thousands of years, which is reincarnation.
Mm.
We come multiple times, we come back to our lives, and we have different lives, and we learn in each life, and we move on, and we have different experiences. And my feeling, I mean, again, I've studied a lot in the Eastern side of things, specifically in India and the yogis and that kind of stuff. And reincarnation is just a given. It's not even a question. It's just like, yes. And when I just looked at it from a logical standpoint myself, I was like, if this is the only time I get to be here, it seems pretty brutal, because if it's basically the luck of the draw. So that means if I'm born a man at a certain time period in a certain country, was I born rich or was I born poor? If I was born a woman, if I was born a man of color or a woman of color in South Africa when they had apartheid, or in slavery, like it seems, or if you're born with a deformity, or you're born, like, it just seems like that's kind of like a really brutal way to look at life. Reincarnation made so much more sense that we come back for different experiences and so on. So what's your explanation of it, and what do you have to say in regards to it?
We could talk all hour just on reincarnation.
Of course.
My memories about this go back to the third grade. I think I was about 9 years old when my classmate, Lee Rosenthal, gave a book report on, back in the 1950s, a book about reincarnation that had been published at the time. It was a bestseller called The Search for Bridie Murphy.
Oh, I've heard of that book. Yeah.
A woman who had been hypnotized, and under hypnosis, this whole 17th century Irish personality came out called Bridie Murphy. And so that was the book. And so Lee Rosenthal is giving his book report, and he says, this book says that we lived before this lifetime. And at that moment, even though I'm a little 9-year-old kid, I felt electricity running up and down my spine. It was like, it really affected me strongly. Now, so I think there's a lot to be said about reincarnation. Today, the major center for the study of this phenomenon is the University of Virginia. The Department of Personality Perceptual Studies, DOPS, at the University of Virginia Medical School. They've been researching this for half a century, and they have a database of over 2,500 cases from all over the world where young children, as soon as they can begin to speak, they start talking about, I used to live in this village, and I had these parents, and this used to be my name, and you're not my real mommy. My real mommy lives in that other village, and all of these things. And researchers get called in to study such cases. And there are actually, of the 2,500 cases, approximately 1,700 of them are considered to be what they call solved, which means that the information that the young children provides actually led to the identification of the previous personality. So when you look at that database, that's just one example of dozens supporting the existence of past of survival of the personality after the death of the body. But that database alone is makes the case for it.
And when I mean, I've had a lot of guests on the show who have had near-death experiences, and have studied Raymond Moody, who studied, kind of the godfather of near-death experiences and coining the phrase near-death experience, all of that. After talking to them and listening to these stories, many of them are similar in scope. It's interesting that some very Eden Alexander, for example, who is a neuroscientist, complete atheist, complete skeptic. And this thing that happened to him, and he came back from death completely unexplainable. It was like an unexplainable return. He should have been legally dead, but he came back. And when he did come back, he was able to write all this stuff down. That, I mean, other than being extremely entertaining to listen to these stories, they seem to be there's a lot of similarities culturally, from culture to culture, depending on where you are in the world throughout time, these kind of stories keep coming up. So for me, that's a really interesting piece of evidence towards the case of reincarnation, if you will.
Well, the evidence from near-death experience certainly is evidence for an afterlife, but I don't think it means that everybody has to reincarnate. I think it's possible that you can go into the afterlife and you have many options at that point. Reincarnation is one of them if you want to come back to this dense physical earth plane, but you could also move up the various levels that have been described in the spiritualist literature and elsewhere of the gradual evolution of the human soul. It's sort of a mystical path, ultimately leading to mystical union with the divine.
Now, what is your definition of consciousness?
I have a simple definition. I don't think it's complicated. Consciousness is having the experience of being who you are.
Interesting.
It's like, what is it like to be you? That's consciousness.
And being aware of that.
Yeah. Well, even if you're not aware of it, that's being conscious of being conscious. But even just having the experience of having experiences at all, seeing the color red, for example, is a conscious experience. Whether you know you're thinking that we call it sometimes a metacognitive stance. You could say, yes, I see red, and I see that I'm seeing red, and I see that I'm seeing myself seeing red. And it's like an infinite regress at times.
Now, going along with reincarnation, can you discuss karma, which is and you might know this better than I do, that did start in the Indian culture, karma, or in with the Bhagavad Gita or Hinduism, or did it come from somewhere else?
Well, of course, the Vedanta literature and the Buddhist literature refers to karma and reincarnation. I can tell you this, it's a very interesting finding. The research that we have, the 2,500 cases that are at the University of Virginia, don't support the classical notions that people have of reincarnation and karma that come out of the Indian culture. The idea you're a bad person in one life, you're going to be punished in your next life. I remember studying in anthropology, there was a village in India where they believed if you're a very bad person in that village, in your next lifetime, as your punishment, you'll be reborn as an American. And you'll have to live in this materialistic culture where it'll be very hard for you to pursue your authentic spiritual growth. But what the research literature, what we gather from the cases that have actually been studied is that what persists from lifetime to lifetime isn't a sense of reward and punishment at all, but a sense of the habits that you carry forth. If you're a person who has strong inclinations or habits of thought and action in one lifetime, you're likely to carry those with you into the next lifetime. Or often we also see in the cases of people who remember their past lives that a very high percentage of them happen to remember their lives because they were violently killed in the previous lifetime. And so they come into their next lifetime perhaps with a phobia related to how they died in the previous lifetime. One of the most fascinating kinds of evidence that we have is that people who are, let's say, stabbed or shot in a past lifetime are often born with birthmarks that correspond to the death wounds of the previous life. So you have certain things that carry over from lifetime to lifetime, but I haven't seen anything in the literature that suggests that if you're a bad person for any reason in one lifetime, that in the next lifetime you're going to be punished for that. Not saying it doesn't happen, but it's certainly not in the sense that some people talk about instant karma. It doesn't seem to work that way at all.
No, I understand. Yeah, I mean, that's kind of been accepted into the zeitgeist. The word karma is like, oh, you're going to get, that's instant karma. You do something bad and right away something bad back happens to you. My explanation or my understanding of karma from my point of view is just that karma is not a good or bad thing. It is part of the evolution of the soul. So what we consider good or bad is a duality that doesn't exist in the afterlife or in the soul's evolution. It is something that the soul actually looks for because it needs to go through. So something like the soul wanting, like, I want to go through pain. We can't conceive that because we just want to be happy all the time and we want to have pleasure all the time. We don't want pain, but for the evolution of the soul, that pain might happen. So if you did something good or bad in a prior lifetime, that you haven't learned that lesson, you probably shouldn't kill people. Well, now you're going to feel that pain, and now hopefully you learn and evolve that way. So it's not a punishment. I agree with you 100%, but from my studies, or at least my understanding of it, is more of part of the evolution of the soul, and there is no good or bad in that space. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense, and it reminds me of, in the near-death literature, there's something called the past life review that a high percentage of near-death experiencers talk about, where you get to experience the impact that you have had on all the other people in your life, moment by moment, second by second, and you experience it from their perspective. So if you hurt somebody, then you get to experience what that felt like to them when they were hurt. And people say that it can, on our Earth time, it might only take a few minutes, but they can go through lifetimes of experience in this altered state of consciousness or near-death state and experience these things. And it's fascinating how it's not experienced as an observer, it's experienced as a participant.
Isn't it interesting when you said time? Time is such a construct that it doesn't, I mean, it exists, but it doesn't exist because perception is all about, time is all about perception. My cat perceives time very differently than I do. Yeah. The gnat that was born a few seconds ago and will die in 10 minutes or an hour, however long a gnat lives, their perception of time is completely different. If you leave this solar system, is it 12 o'clock somewhere in the universe? So time is really interesting on just as you just want to start getting really deep into that, where in the soul's evolution and what we do, this life is fairly quick. And as you get older, you feel it's getting quicker and quicker. When you're a kid,
to speed up. Yeah.
As a kid, you're like, 30 is so old. And like you and I both would kill to be 30. With our minds today, please. But it's just, I always find that very interesting, the concept of time and how we look at it, and we're all of that. I'd just love to hear your thoughts about it as well.
Well, I imagine, for example, that a star might be a conscious entity, for all we know, or a galaxy. And whereas the human, a moment, when you talk about what is a moment, a unit of consciousness for a human being, it's roughly a fifth of a second, maybe a tenth of a second. But if you're a star, or a galaxy, or a group of galaxies of such are conscious entities, a moment might last what we think of as billions of years.
It's all perception. If you're percepting it as a star, as a galaxy, as a gnat, or as a human being, it's a completely different understanding of how you look at things. And I know that makes a lot of people listening, maybe their head starts to hurt a little bit when you start going, wait a minute, with the time? I'm like, just think about it for a second. If there was no sun, if there was no rotation, if we lived on Jupiter, time would be different. If we lived on Mars, time would be different. It's just a different perception of that. I'd love to ask you about the concept of duality. and non-duality. What can you define that for me, please?
Well, normally our everyday world is a world of duality. We think, especially in terms of good and bad, right and wrong, evil and not evil is a question of duality. Life and death is duality. So we're always making judgments. That's the world that we live in. But from a mystical point of view, everything is one. All the dualities are actually illusory. I mean, they're real insofar as at this level, you can't deny, I think, especially today, we're at the edge of a World War III. You see good and evil being played out on our television sets every day. But at a different level, it's like you're reading a novel, you're reading War and Peace. And after you finish the novel, you can put it down and you can appreciate all the characters in the novel and say, what a wonderful story it was. A good story has a mixture of good and evil, but you can transcend the whole story in a way.
Yeah, it was interesting. I was speaking to another guest the other day, and he said something that was so profound to me. I never really thought about it. He's like, no matter what part of life you're in, and you could be talking about the micro with yourself or the macro, which is the unit of the world. Mm-hmm. When evil comes up, let's say, there's a balance of good that comes up against it. And when that evil goes down, the good goes down. And he says, look at history. Anytime there was a great disruption, you could use World War II, for example, great amount of pain and suffering and evil came up. Well, there was an immense amount of on the opposite side that came into to fight that. And now that's happening now in front of our eyes every day on the television. It's like what Russia is doing is an immense amount of evil. And it's just horrible what they're doing. But then the world is starting to unite in a way that I haven't seen in my lifetime before. So it's really interesting to start thinking about that. And he's like, even if let's say your mom never hugged you, did you have an aunt that hugged you? Was it a teacher? Was it a friend's mom? Somewhere the balance of what you were missing finds its way to you in some way, shape, or form, generally speaking. What do you think of that?
Well, there are many spiritual traditions that are based on the notion of non-duality. Mm-hmm. I was raised in the Jewish religion, so we have, the idea of one God. But there's a legend, I think, from the Jewish tradition that sort of explains this. Moses goes up to Mount Sinai and he receives the Ten Commandments from God. And it's basically, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might, which really means love everything, love everyone, all the time. And Moses comes down and he sees the children of Israel worshiping the golden calf.
Right.
And he gets angry and he takes the tablets of the unitary view of the world. Sometimes they call it the Torah of the tree of life. And he smashes it. And the legend is that all the letters flew back up. And Moses has to go back up to Mount Sinai a second time because he sees the children of Israel aren't ready for the Torah of the tree of life. And when he comes back down with the second set of tablets, this is now the Torah of the knowledge of good and evil. It's about how do you live in a world of duality, because you're not yet ready to live in a world of unity.
Now, with all your experience and studies, why do you believe that it is so difficult for us to be our authentic selves, to be true to who we are, and to honor that inner thing that makes us special? I use the term secret sauce. There's a secret sauce that nobody else in the world has but you, and that you're here for that purpose. Why do we stop ourselves from being authentic? Because I studied being successful in the film industry and all this kind of stuff. And everybody who's successful in every aspect of life, every part from art to business, they are authentically themselves. Every master, every titan of industry, they were all authentic to themselves and they were comfortable in their own skin. Why do we have such problems being comfortable in our own skin?
Well, when I became a graduate student in in parapsychology in Berkeley, I had a mentor who had set up an institute and invited me to live there with him, Arthur M. Young. He set up the Institute for the Study of Consciousness in Berkeley. And he was an inventor. He invented the Bell helicopter, first commercially licensed helicopter. And he was also a cosmologist. He wrote a great book called The Reflexive Universe. And one day he said to me, Jeffrey, what do you think is the philosopher's stone, the mystical stone that turns lead into gold? And he was referring to the soul, the lead in your soul into gold. I said, I don't know. He said, it's the obstacles that we face in life. That's the philosopher's stone. We have to confront those obstacles, and then our soul gets refined, and we become closer to who we are. So I think we all come here. We're here on this physical plane in order to face obstacles that you can't find anywhere else.
It's kind of like you harden the steel by smashing it against a stone. It needs to be sharpened.
Or you temper the steel by heating it red hot or white hot.
And pounding it.
Yeah.
Pounding it again and again and again. And that's what makes us strong and makes us move forward. I love this. I heard this somewhere, and I love using this example. The boiling water softens the potato but hardens the egg. The same boiling water does both. Yeah. And I thought that was it's so profound at so many levels. I was like, yeah, you're absolutely right. So it's the boiling water is the obstacle, and for some it softens them, but for others it hardens them so they can move forward. Yeah. So it's interesting. Now, I'd love to discuss the mind-brain relationship. You talk a lot about that. What is the mind-brain relationship, which is our best friend and our worst enemy all at the same time?
Well, from a philosophical point of view, there's something called the mind-body problem, which is a problem, an unsolvable problem that the materialists have, which is if we live in a cold, dead universe of inanimate matter, how do you get consciousness? And nobody has yet figured that out. I interviewed some 30 years ago Francis Crick, one of the great scientists of the 20th century, the man who discovered the double helix nature of the DNA molecule.
Okay.
And he had published a new book called The Astonishing Hypothesis. His hypothesis was that the brain creates consciousness. Now, most of your viewers sort of naively assume, well, hasn't that been proven a long time ago? Everybody knows the brain creates consciousness. And Crick had the honesty to say to me, it is only a hypothesis. It hasn't been proven. In fact, he said, and I have it on camera, the religious point of view might be correct, that consciousness survives the death of the body. And of course, Crick is no longer alive. I think if he were alive, he'd have to admit we have yet to prove that consciousness is produced by the brain. I would go so far as to say it's exactly the opposite. The brain exists within consciousness.
I would agree, because
it exists within consciousness.
So the question is, if you're conscious and then someone's telling you who's driving the car that you're conscious of, there's someone driving it in the background. There's someone talking to you, like, well, who is that person? And like, how, like, you're right. You can't really prove it. You can't prove where it comes from, because it's like trying to grab water with your fist. It's impossible. You might get a little bit in your hand, but you're definitely not going to grab hold of it. It's a fascinating conversation. It's a fascinating thing. This conversation has been extremely fascinating, Jeffrey. I want to ask you a question. I ask. Well, first of all, I want to ask you one last question. what is the future of human evolution?
Wow, that's a big one. And I have to say, it's the evolution of consciousness itself. I guess, really, even to begin to answer that question, we have to ask, what is the present of human evolution? And maybe I'm unusual. I think of myself not as a person who was born in 1946 and who will probably die sometime in the next 20 or 30 years. I think of myself as a person who is actually at least billions of years old. I mean, my body is certainly, it evolved from single-celled organisms billions of years ago. And I suspect it may have gone through many cycles like that. That's who I really am. In fact, I go even further and say that I subscribe to the mystical vision that all is one, so that you and I are, one might say, different versions of each other.
Right.
As well as all of your viewers and listeners, or the same with every animal, every octopus, every grizzly bear, or extraterrestrial or insect, that we share what the philosopher Schopenhauer called the one mind that sees through the eyes of every living creature. So
that's that. So that answers our current consciousness. So what is the future of human evolution?
Well, that would be the realization of that, not just intellectually as I'm explaining it to you, but understanding it experientially. That I think is the path of spiritual growth.
And understanding that we are all connected, and when you hurt one, you hurt us all in so many ways. And the more as I've walked the earth a little bit during my life, I started to realize how much we're connected and how interconnected we are. I mean, if you just look at nature, nature's interconnected, interdependent on so many things that have to click for nature to work in the ecosystems that is nature. And now I feel that the world, because we're first time in human history, so connected with the internet, so interdependent on each other economically, that now we see what's happening in Russia, where we're literally just completely canceling or ghosting an entire country for right reasons, of course. But how that's like, wait a minute, if I'm not connected to the rest, will I survive? How can I survive without being connected to the rest? So it's a really interesting conversation to be had to understand that we are all truly connected and interdependent on each other. I promise you, if there was a Independence Day style attack tomorrow, everybody would be cool with each other. Everybody would be like, we got to get together and work on this. There's a giant machine coming down and blowing up the world. Isn't that funny the way that always works out?
Well, I think that's why people like Ronald Reagan used to talk about, what if the world were confronting an alien invader? It would be a way of uniting this world.
Yeah, I hope we don't have to go through that to unite. I truly don't. I think we have enough going on in the world right now. I hope we don't have to deal with that as well. Now, I ask a question I ask all my guests. What is your mission in this life?
A good question. And I am reminded of the moment I took training. I studied a fellow named Ted Owens, the PK Man. I've written a book about him, published 20 years ago. He had enormous psychic powers. And I took his training program at one point in 1986. He could control earthquakes, tornadoes, hurricanes, power blackouts, UFO sightings, and the like, volcanoes. And so he said to me, what do you want to do with these powers, taking this training? I thought about it and I realized I'm not interested in doing any of the things that you're doing, which I had been documenting for 10 years. Mm-hmm. I said, what I want to do is to be a communicator to the mainstream of the public about these esoteric, psychic, occult, mystical realities. And that's what I've been up to. Shortly after I took that training, I founded my first television show, Thinking Aloud, that ran on national public television for close to 15 years. And now I'm doing a YouTube channel, the New Thinking Aloud YouTube channel. So my mission has consistently been, since that time, to make these realities communicable to the public at large.
Jeffrey, and where can people find out more about you, your books, and your work, sir?
The simplest way is to go to New Thinking Aloud, that's all one word, .com. And it's aloud is not ALOUD, it's ALLOWED. newthinkingaloud.com. That'll take you to the YouTube channel. And we also have a foundation, newthinkingaloud.org.
Jeffrey, thank you so much for coming on the show, and I appreciate all the hard work you've been doing over these many, many decades of your work. So thank you, my friend. I appreciate you.
It's been a real pleasure. I'm delighted to meet you, Alex. You seem like a kindred spirit.
Thanks for watching. Click on one of the videos below to continue your journey, and don't forget to subscribe.